Mm. Hi, Dylan. I'm just waiting for this number to flatten out a little bit. Sweet. We'll just wait one more minute and then get started. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our webinar on power research for divestment. My name's Kian, and I'm with the Endowment Justice Research Network. We are a group of undergrads, grad students from various universities. Today we'll have presentations from students at the University of Michigan and Yale. And we've convened this teach-in just to Skillshare some things we've learned about researching our own endowments and to get into contact with more people wanting to do this kind of work. I'm just going to give some brief intros for our presenters and then let them take the wheel. Today we'll have Dennis M. Hogan, Derek Seidman, Nathan Kim, and Tara and Samarth talk. Dennis is just finishing a postdoc at Haverford, where he taught about university studies and the history of the university. And his specialty is not in that, or he studied 19th century Spanish literature, Central American literature, and has gone more into the elite capture of the university more recently. Derek is a contributor to Truth Out and LittleSis, who is going to present a more general kind of overview about how to research the university endowment. Nathan is a PhD candidate at the School of Information at the University of Michigan, who researches digital tools for organizers. And Taran is a PhD student at Yale, studying political science and researching accountability in local democracies. Yeah, I feel good about that. Oh, one more thing before we start. I knew I had left something out. We'll have a brief Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A part of the Zoom rather than in the general chat. And we'll probably be able to take a few questions. Okay. I will turn it over to Dennis whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'll go right away. Can everybody hear and see me okay? Folks looking good. All right. So yeah, my name's Dennis. As Kian said, I'm a scholar, writer, and organizer. I work on the political economy of higher education. And I got into this work, even though I was trained in comparative literature and do 19th century literary studies, through labor organizing within the university. And I've since now taught a couple of classes on contemporary US higher ed and political perspective. I've also written and published a little bit about endowments and organizing, which is why I'm really happy to be joining you. And I'm just going to set a timer so that I don't go over my time. So I'm going to try to give a 10-minute overview of what the endowment is, what it does, why it exists, and how it historically evolved. And then, try to end in some thoughts with about what the fight for divestment from Israeli apartheid means for higher education today. And so this is like a historical contextual overview. It's definitely like a rough and ready adaptation of some of my work on the history of the endowment. Happy to answer questions or provide references. This is not the like skills learning part of the webinar today, but I'm really looking forward to that. So let's just start with a definition. An endowment's a permanent fund invested as capital to support the activities of a college, university, or other institution into perpetuity. So the principle of the endowment, which is, depending on who you ask, either like the original investment or the part that doesn't get realized as profits, never is to be diminished, while the profits on the investment can either be directed towards operating expenses or reinvested into the endowment to grow the capital. Primary source of endowment capital is charitable gifts to universities placed in trust for management by the institution. And the fact that like the original investments are never withdrawn is very important for like how university investment offices think about their strategies. So endowments are especially important in the United States, although it's not the only place where endowments exist. They also represent substantial stores of value. So in 2023, the National Association of College and University Business Officers, which is called NACUBO, surveyed 699 U.S. institutions holding funds, and the value of these funds totaled $839 billion. So we're talking about a pretty substantial sum of money. So while this may seem like a pretty simple concept, or one at least that we've all grown pretty used to in contemporary higher ed, it's not actually so clear why colleges have such big endowments. And in fact, this was the point made by the legal scholar Henry Hansman all the way back in 1990, who wrote an essay which I commend to all of you called "Why Do Universities Have Endowments?" which has subsequently gone on to be like quite an influential paper in the field. And Hansman basically argues, you know, there are good reasons why a university would want to like put money aside. And even to have money invested as capital. And that includes, you know, the concept of intergenerational equity. Those of you who've like organized against your own investment offices will have heard this term. Basically, the idea that future generations have a right to an institution that is as good as or better than the one that current generations get to experience. As well as like political independence, intellectual freedom, ensuring against economic downturns or drastic political catastrophes. So like if the United States government was to collapse or to stop funding higher education entirely, colleges and universities could continue to exist theoretically using their endowments to stopgap. Or like if there was like a dramatic, like imagine like if there was a stock market crash, like I don't know, in 2008 or something. This is sort of the idea. But Hansman makes the point that even allowing for like those contingencies, what universities had saved up or invested, even in 1990, would in the case of the richest schools, far outlast any of those contingencies. And so it sort of is like, well, what is it really for? Hansman doesn't come to an answer. And so let's kind of go back. I'll do a quick like 2-minute, like how did we get here to the 1990s, and then we'll see how much things have changed even since then. So early on, right, in the 19th century, endowments didn't necessarily mean a capital fund, but they referred to financial and physical resources. So the land, the buildings, all of these were part of the school's endowments. Colleges didn't act as capitalists. In other words, they didn't necessarily invest money to fund profit-making activities to then realize profits on the money that they invested. They acted much more like any other nonprofit. They took in money that they then used to fund operations. And it didn't mean that they didn't make some strategic investments, but the idea was not that there was like a separate arm of the college or university that was engaged in capital-driven profiteering. By the end of the 19th century, there was a massive expansion of higher education that was a product of industrialization and also a product of like massive philanthropy from like Gilded Age philanthropists. So think about like Stanford, Rockefeller, all of these people whose name, Johns Hopkins, all these people whose names are on buildings or universities. Harvard, no surprise, innovated the use of like endowment as capital. No, I'm sorry. I'm just talking. There's no slides. I hope that that is okay. Sorry, responding to a question there in the chat. Harvard innovated the idea of like using endowments as capital by the 1920s or 30s. the idea of like an endowment in the sense that we now understand it had been established. Other elite schools followed suit. By the 1960s, a typical investment portfolio was like 2/3 stocks, 1/3 bonds or other super secure instruments. And so like in the 19th century, colleges that had investments didn't hold stocks at all. It was like 100% bonds. So this is a huge change. By the 1980s, so skipping maybe 20 years in time, you should be thinking about like Wall Street, the movie, about like the Reagan era, about deregulation and like the unleashing of financial markets. And that makes endowments grow even more vertiginously and endowment managers start to pursue even more aggressive strategies. So now we come to kind of when Hansman is writing, 1990. Harvard has a $4.7 billion endowment, which would be $11 billion today. Yale, $2.5 billion, which would be $6.2 billion today. And Brown, where I did my PhD, only $425 million in 1990, which would be $1 billion today. So basically total paupers. Harvard now has 50 billion, Yale 42 billion, and Brown still only 6 billion. But you know, the growth between even in that last 34 years has been exponential. Why? The introduction of something called the endowment model. And so when you hear the endowment model, you should think of David Swensen, the person who's probably single-handedly like most responsible for what endowments look like today. Swensen was the endowment manager at Yale in the early 1990s, and he understood that because endowments never withdraw the capital, they can invest in things that are very, very difficult to liquidate, investments that are very difficult to liquidate, and then have, you know, enormous time spans. And so the main thing that he did was he introduced a much greater reliance on what's called alternatives. And here I'm relying on the definitions of Josh Lerner, Antoinette Shore, and Jialin Wang, who said that that includes things like hedge funds, commodities like oil and timber, private equity buyout, and venture funds. And this is the model that colleges and universities have subsequently followed. So I'm already at 8 minutes. So I just want to stop here and say that the endowment model primarily benefited the schools, the wealthiest schools who got in first. And so between 1992 and 2007, these alternative assets, as they're called, enormously gained for the schools that were able to take advantage of them. Other people, even now, continue to try to emulate them. And while they do make money, you know, they don't make money on the order of what David Swensen made for Yale. In fact, the real story of endowments is one of stark inequality. While the wealthiest institutions each have tens of billions of dollars in assets, most colleges and universities have assets so negligible that they're not even counted in the survey. So 142 institutions have 1 billion or more in holdings, which is about 20% of colleges and universities, but they have over 85% of the total endowment value held by all colleges and universities. Obviously, you know, that mirrors kind of how things have been going in the entire economy, where the wealthiest get wealthier and everyone else struggles to survive. That also mirrors many of the distinctions of race and class and, you know, relationship to the economy, where primarily white institutions have many more resources related to endowments than historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and community colleges. So I'm at 10 minutes. So I just want to wrap up here and say, as we kind of like move into the next portion, that this rising tide of pro-Palestine activism is calling the question of the endowment, though it's important to take note that even if endowments are now the target of divestment demands, that's because we've been talking about them for years in the context of the legacies of slavery, context of their contribution to climate change, their ties to weapons manufacturers and war profiteers, and also because of their grotesque size and their role in perpetuating inequality. I don't think I need to recite the connections between university endowments and the ongoing assault on Gaza for this crowd, but they include ties between universities and companies on the BDS list, between universities and weapons manufacturers and war profiteers, and also between research done in universities and the war machine generally, the IDF specifically, and in some cases, direct investments in Israeli companies with IDF or defense sector ties. So I'll end by saying that challenging these relationships requires challenging two major aspects of the university today. First, the longstanding interconnection between higher education, research, and the defense sector, which has existed for decades and on which the post-war university is built. And second, the profit above all and at any cost logic of the contemporary endowment, which, though it is not as old as the connection to the defense industry, is still a dominant way that university managers think and how they operate. So I will leave it there. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Yeah, that was really interesting to hear, Dennis. So my name's Derek. I have worked for many years with the corporate watchdog group LittleSis. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you to the Endowment Justice Research Network for inviting me, for inviting LittleSis to participate. You all are doing some really amazing research, amazing work. And so anybody on this webinar who wants to get plugged into that network, I think they have something for you to sign up in. Maybe someone can put it in the chat. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to be taking about 15 to 20 minutes to just do a real basic overview, kind of bird's eye view of some tactics, some research tactics that anyone can use to try to research your school's endowment. This is obviously like a really important starting point for any campaign that you want to do around divestment. If you're able to identify, specific investments that your endowment has, it can really provide a lot of, leverage and seriousness to the campaign. I should also say I will be sharing my screen in a second, so I'll have there'll be plenty of visuals and things to look at in a second. So this is, really important groundwork, I think, for any divestment campaign. I'm not going to lie, it's sometimes, not easy. There's no guarantees, university endowments can be very opaque. Some schools you might have a lot of luck, some schools you might have little luck or no luck, right? But there is a lot of information out there. You just got to know how to find it. And so I'm just going to go over a few of those tactics. And one thing I'll also say is that, while, we're here against the backdrop of, looking into, weapons manufacturers and connection to Palestinian solidarity movement and so on. This can be used for anything. If you want to research fossil fuel investments, if you want to research investments in private prisons, what have you, right? So let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Now, just to start off real quick, before I get into like the specific tactics here, I wanted to just go over like what do universities actually invest in, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Because you could spend a lot of time talking about this stuff, but this was a graph that was in a recent Washington Post article about basically what endowments invest in across the board. And to make a long story short, like about the top two things, private equity, marketable alternatives, those are really aggressive financial investments, private equity and hedge funds. And the third one, US equities, that's like US stocks. Then you got venture capital, and then you have like international stocks, fixed income, things like bonds, real estate, real assets, things like real estate, right? So when you think about the endowment and what it's invested in, like these are the types of things that we're talking about. And you could do your own research project to try to learn more about what those are. We don't have the time to talk about that here, but just to make it a little less abstract, right? Also, for the purposes of the conversation today, I want to just emphasize three things that universities invest in, right? There's more than this, but I want to emphasize three things. One is stocks, and that's just, direct investments in corporations via shareholding, right? Another thing is bonds, right? And those are basically you're buying debt, right? So for example, if you buy a corporate bond, let's say Google wants to raise some money, and so it sells off its debt, you can buy units of that debt, and you'll get a return, a bigger return on it over time, right? Um, and you can also buy sovereign bonds. So for example, you can buy Israel bonds, right? Bonds that are, go towards a country, right? So stocks and bonds, important things. And then finally, I just wanted to mention funds. And what I mean when I'm talking about funds, these are basically pooled investments into like a single unit, right? The unit being the fund. And I'm just going to mention two different types of funds here. One might be called like alternative investments or private equity, right? This is when you invest in a fund, and that fund has investments like different private investments or like really aggressive investments. Those are a little more secretive, or not secretive, but a little harder to research, but you can still do it. And then you have index and passive funds, right? And those are things that a lot of universities invest in these as well. And what that is basically you buy, like, if you look at the image on the side of the screen here, basically you can buy a share of a fund, and that fund is invested in many different companies. So when you buy that share, you're invested in a bunch of different companies through that share, right? And that's going to come back to being important today, right? So I'll get back to that, but that's just some sort of like initial grounding. I'm going to go through 5 ways that you can research your endowment. And they're going to go from, I think, easiest to hardest, as well as the ones that are like, some of them are less fruitful, some of them are more fruitful, but we'll just dig into it. And the way that I'm going to do this is just kind of demonstrating them all for you really quickly, okay? And the speakers that are coming after me, that are going to be doing case studies, they're going to be talking about, more concrete, specific examples of some of this general stuff that I'm going to be talking about right now. So, if you have questions, or it goes quickly, it goes by quickly. This stuff is going to be, I think, referenced a few times today. Okay, and also I'll throw some links into the chat after this with some sort of like how-to guides that we put together on how to research some of this stuff too. But I'm going to go through first just very simply strategic web searches, then looking at university investment office pages, publicly available investment portfolios, 990 forms, and SEC searches. And we'll explain what those are. So here. So I bookmarked all these searches just to keep it quicker, right? So I'm going to first open, this is an example of a strategic web search, okay? Now, basically what you want to do is you use the name of your school, and you want to use keywords like maybe endowment or investment portfolio, schedule of investment, things like that, right? There's different keywords. You can also do things like a specific file type, like you're looking for a PDF. So if you look at the top here, you see I did this thing that says file type PDF, and that turns up only PDF files, right? So I just, did this this is something you just got to play around with a lot, right? University endowment portfolio, Iowa, whatever, Iowa, right? Just random state, right? File type PDF. If you go down, I've looked at these already, but so this is why I'm doing this very quickly, right? But here's an example of, Board of Regents, State of Iowa, a PowerPoint that they gave, right? And I'll just go to the end of it here, and it goes through like a lot of information on their portfolio, and you get to the end, and it shows a lot of those different funds that Iowa State's invested in, right? Their University of Iowa. There are probably other ways to find this online. They might be publicly available. It's a public university, but that's just, one example. And so I would urge you to first play around with that, right? So try doing these strategic web searches where you use your university's name, and then sort of like this financial language. You can also, try to look at certain, there's websites like trade journals called Pensions and Investments or Barron's, Bloomberg. A lot of these sometimes have news articles about endowments and different new endowment investments, things like that, right? So just simply by playing around with like these strategic web searches, you'll be able to find a lot, I promise you, right? I shouldn't promise you actually, depending on your university, right? But you often can. The second thing is what I had mentioned about sort of looking at university investment offices. Now, again, this is just an example, right? So you'll see here that I put into the search Williams College Investment Office. Nothing against Williams College. It was just came to my mind when I was doing this, right? So almost all colleges and universities will have something like this, an investment office, right? Now, sometimes that investment office, especially if it's a public university, it might just have like the investment portfolio on it, right? Or a link to it or information on it. A lot of times it won't, but it will have some things, right? So for example, where was this here? Okay, I'm going to just click on here where it says annual reports, right? And I'll go down here. Okay, let's go to, 2023 annual report. So you go down here. This is just, these annual reports are often just sort of big picture financial information. But something interesting that you see right here is that almost at the beginning, it's the allocation of Williams investments, right? How much is in real estate, how much is in, private equity. They have different names for it here, but, and so what you don't see here is the specific investments, right? That's not in this brochure. But what you do see is sort of like what the university's invested in. So if you're having trouble like finding specific investments, you can still leverage stuff like this around your demands, right? Because one of the demands is disclose, right? Well, we know you're invested in all these funds, like, right? What are those funds? It says 25% of the endowment is in XYZ, right? So, part of this is it's like putting a puzzle together, right? So this stuff can be like a way to start off as well. But getting into more specifics, I want to get into the third thing, and that is publicly available investment portfolios. And I think we're going to have some examples of this in the case studies that come up, right? But oftentimes this is particularly the case for public universities, right? They're public and they're often, and so sometimes they, not always, but sometimes they disclose, their whole investment portfolios, right? So I'm not going to explain how I got to this, but this is basically just did do some searching. University of Texas, financial statements, investment portfolio. If you do a little digging, you'll be able to find this, right? So University of Texas, the system is one of those examples of a state university system that has its portfolios public, right? So I'm going down here. This is called the detailed schedule of investments, right? Investment securities. So I'm going to click on the most recent one, and it's a long document. And if you start scrolling down, you'll just see it. There's like all these investments. Now, University of Texas has one of the biggest endowments in the country, right? So there's a lot of investments here. But you can do things like, let's hit Control F, and I'm just going to do like Lockheed, right? And so, yeah, there you see it has, this is around $1 million invested in Lockheed Martin. And if you did the same thing for other weapons companies, it would be something similar, right? I'll just give you another example, right? And I think Nathan might be showing Michigan's later. I'm not sure. I don't want to put Nathan to the on the spot, but I think he might be giving an example of this. So here's another one, right? I did this same thing with University of Washington, right? And they might have their portfolio available. I didn't look long enough to see if I could find it. But what I immediately found on the reports page of their investment site is they have these performance reports. Those don't tell you specific investments. But I guess apparently, according to Washington state law, you have to university has to disclose its private investments, right? So you go here, and what you see here is just all of these different, if you remember those funds that I was telling you about, these are those sort of alternative private funds that I was talking about. They have, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in these, right? And with all of these funds, you might be saying to me, well, what do I do with this, Derek, right? Well, we don't have time to do it now, but you can take any of these funds, start searching it, start digging into it. I promise you'll find, news articles, different things online about what the fund is invested in. And, it takes work. Like, you'll have to do some research. You can get a little research crew together. It's sort of, again, another piece of the puzzle that you can use in trying to kind of map out investments, right? So got about a few more minutes here. I just want to move to the two last things. And these ones are probably, a little more challenging. So one is 990 forms. Basically, universities, most universities are nonprofits. If you're a nonprofit, you have to annually file something called a Form 990. It's just basically this form to the IRS that talks about like your net, your budgets, who's on your board, salaries, conflicts. It has just a different info that we won't get into it all right now. You can, explore them yourselves, right? But one thing it sometimes has is investments that are made, right? So I'm going to just put here for a second. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to click on this here because I was going to do Harvard, but Harvard has some complicated name. Yeah, presidents and fellows of Harvard College, right? So, I'm going to click on view filing 990. And it's this very long thing. If you want to find out how much the president of Harvard makes, it's in here, right? But what I'm going to do is go down to this schedule R, right? The schedule R is important. That's the part of the 990 report that has information about like different partnerships and holdings, right? So I'm going to go down a little bit, and you'll see there's all these. If you see what these names of things here, these are all different sort of investment partnerships that Harvard has. They're all different. A lot of it is real estate, but some of them are different funds that are invested in things. And so again, any of these you could research and try to find out what they're invested in. You might be able to find out, you might not be able to. You could use it as leverage to, ask that Harvard explains more. But that's one way to go about it, right? I should also say this ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer, in my opinion, is the best place to look for these 990 forms, right? So I'm going to also do here, University of Chicago, right? So I want to show you one other thing here. That's University of Chicago. Now, if you're, I'm going to go down a few years back. And I do recommend not just looking at the most recent year, but going a few years back. If you're able or lucky enough to find one of these things that says 990T, that's really important because that can often have a lot of really direct information on what they're invested in, right? So a few years ago, University of Chicago published this, and it had all of these different funds and their partnerships that they're invested in. A lot of them are fossil fuels. See, like this is a partnership with Phillips 66, right? And you can just see by the names, a lot of these are fossil fuel partnerships, right? So those 990Ts can be particularly helpful. It's often hit or miss with these 990s. You might find more information in some of them. You might find less. You might find a lot. You might find none. But that's an important place, again, to start looking. Finally, and I think I will end under 20 minutes here, thankfully. You can look at the in the Security and Exchange Commission's EDGAR database, right? So the SEC is basically a regulatory body that was set up during the New Deal that regulates financial markets, right? And a lot of different companies and different investors have to annually or quarterly or at different times disclose certain information about their financial activities, right? It's part of the sort of regulatory process and also information for investors and so on. And that's useful because a lot of information is online, in these filings, right? And so universities that are investing, a certain threshold of money into public markets need to file these things, right? And so I'll just give you like an example, right, or an example or two, right? So here's Regents of University of California, right? Now, if you would click on any of these things that say statement of beneficial ownership by certain investors, it'll show you specific investments that the Regents have. But one of the things that's particularly useful is these ones that say 13 FHR. Sometimes they say 13 something else, but it says quarterly report filed by institutional managers, holdings. So I'm going to click on this piece where it says filing, and I'm going to click where it says information table right here. And here's all these investments that the Regents of University of California have, right? You see ExxonMobil, Honeywell, that's a company that does a lot of weapons, work with weapons companies. And you could just, look at them all, right? We'll look at another quick example, right? Let's try, I saw someone say Johns Hopkins in the chat. So yeah, let's do Johns Hopkins University. So again, we'll go to this table, information table of the holdings, and what you interestingly see here, and this is what I'm going to bring it all home here, and then I'm stopping. Okay. What Johns Hopkins shows a lot of investments is in these different mutual funds or index funds, passive funds. If you remember, I talked about those. So these iShares, where it says iShares, what those are funds that are overseen by the biggest asset manager in the world called BlackRock. And if you could click on one of these, right? And I'm just going to Google that, right? And go to the page of this fund, and I'm going to go to where it says holdings. So this is what the fund is invested in, and I'll go to all the holdings, right? So this fund that Johns Hopkins is invested in, what are they invested in through this fund, right? These are all the companies. So I'll put, again, Lockheed Martin. And I think these are actually corporate bonds that these companies put out. We could do, what's another one? Raytheon, right? So again, this is another way to look at this stuff. So I just hit about 20 minutes, so I'll stop there. I'll just say that, this isn't easy work to do. It can be painstaking, but it can also be a lot of fun. And remember, if you can't find stuff, you can use that for your leverage too, right? Why should these universities be so secretive about what they're investing in, right? Hopefully these tips have been helpful, and I'll pass it on to the next presenters to give more concrete examples of these more abstract research strategies, okay?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Derek.
Do you want to take the share screen again, Nathan?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Yep. All right, if everybody can see my screen, I'll go ahead and get started. So we want to describe now how the methods elaborated by Derek can be put into action. What are the ways these different methods apply to different contexts, and what can we do with the information uncovered through this kind of research? Essentially, how do we make meaning out of the data of the kinds that Derek uncovered? To start off, I'll discuss work from researchers at the University of Michigan. My name is Nathan Kim, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan, a proud member of my union, GEO 3550, through which I'm a member of the Terroir Coalition, which I'm representing here today. Using the methods that are described allowed us to be specific about what we were demanding divestment from and prepare seriously for the long-haul divestment fight. To get into this, the University of Michigan offers us a relatively unique but illustrative context for how data can be accessed and used. By virtue of being a public university beholden to state and federal laws, as well as managing its own endowment in-house rather than through any legally separate entity, there are certain levels of transparency that are hugely advantageous for us, but which don't apply to universities like Yale, which Taran will walk us through in a second. Firstly, the University of Michigan is beholden to FOIA requests or Freedom of Information Act requests. These can be frustrating because sometimes they're arbitrarily denied. Not every part of the endowment can answer to these, but they have been an incredibly useful tool for us to gather information on what the University of Michigan is currently invested in. The second source of information, which is even more public-facing, comes from the Regents' meeting minutes. The Board of Regents is the highest governing body within the University of Michigan, and likely your university has the same sort of body, the Board of Regents, the Board of Trustees, and so on. And at the University of Michigan, they're beholden to answer to the Open Meetings Act, which requires them to put their monthly meetings out into the public through their, by releasing their meeting minutes, by inviting the general public to attend their meetings, and so on. So here, this is one document from their June 2024 meeting where the investment office recommends to the Board of Regents the appointment of Booth Bay Fund Management LLC with an initial funding of up to $50 million from the long-term portfolio, one section, the largest section of the university endowments. None of this is to imply that, of course, that the University of Michigan is somehow transparent or accountable or, dare I say, democratic, because there's lots of limitations here. For example, in 2004, the University of Michigan lobbied against it being beholden to these FOIA requests and won what is now called the CRII exemption. So, for example, we found through a separate document that the University of Michigan had invested $37 million into the Israeli shekel in 2022. When we try to file a FOIA request this year to follow up on this and assess if the University of Michigan is still invested in this, it was denied on these grounds. And though the Regents' meeting minutes are technically beholden to the Open Meetings Act, in fact, most meetings that the Regents participate in happen behind closed doors. There's an investments committee of the Board of Regents, but this committee, which is a subset of the Board of Regents as a whole, is simply deemed as an informal meeting and thus does not release any documents to the public. And so thus we aren't able to view, for example, their decision-making processes or how they selected a particular fund manager. Thirdly, the endowment is hugely influenced by a donor-run investment advisory committee. This investment advisory committee is populated by industry professionals, these millionaires, sometimes even billionaires, like Stephen Ross, people like J.E.R. Harris, who's a sort of a mega donor in the Chicago world, and so on. Of course, no students, faculty, and staff have any position on this committee. And lastly, huge investments are sent to companies run by these donors and investment advisory committee members, a subject which has been a source of great tension and activism for the past decade. Still, this context allows us to trace where the University of Michigan's money is invested and allows us as divestment organizers to build a campaign around this information. So these include sectors like defense contracting with companies like Endural, an American startup, or British companies like Hopkins and Ultra Electronics, drones and robotics companies like Shield AI and Skydio, which are American startups, or SCDJI, a Chinese startup, all of which send machines to the Israeli Defense Forces. These include Israeli spyware, the most famous of which, probably the most famous Israeli company ever, is NSO Group, or maybe second to Elbit Systems, and also include Israeli tools of repression meant to surveil and repress activism everywhere. So you can also read more about these specific connections at bit.ly/UM Endowment Guide, which I'll put into the chat in a second. So why do we care about these kinds of connections? Firstly, of course, on basic ethical grounds, we need to know what kinds of harms our university is enacting and end every part of it immediately. Strategically, we also want to make our demands clear and specific. That not only makes us harder to ignore by the Regents and administration as a whole, but also helps us embolden our campaign by illustrating exactly how divestment is an issue for every single student at every single university. Tracing that personal connection and showing how the money flows from where we are to harms everywhere across the globe helps us grow our campaign and invite people into the fold. But today, I want to focus on specifically how our research, along with organizing broadly and the principled work of many organizers within the Tahrir Coalition, enabled an expansion of politics within our campaign for divestment. To explain this, I want to start with one case study, which is an Israeli prison surveillance company called Attenti. Attenti manufactures anklet monitors, breathalyzers, GPS software, and so on. It has contracts with many departments of corrections within the United States and generally with states across the globe, including an $18 million contract with the Michigan Department of Corrections. The University of Michigan, of course, has supported Attenti through its former owners, Francisco Partners and Sequoia Capital. To the current day, the University of Michigan has invested over $245 million in Francisco Partners and over $391 million in Sequoia. A second case study that aligns with this is Motorola Solutions. Motorola Solutions is not an Israeli company, it's an American company that has developed Operation Shield, a project that made Atlanta the most surveilled city in the US and is the second largest vendor overall to the Atlanta Police Department. It also, completely coincidentally, of course, has over $100 million in contracts with the Michigan Department of Corrections. But the story doesn't stop there. The reason I'm talking about Atenti and Motorola Solutions is because they harm both here in Michigan and abroad in what is rightfully Palestine. Motorola Solutions was recommended as a divestment target by the American Friends Service Committee and was targeted by, for example, the United Nations and groups like the Private Equity Stakeholder Project for its use of surveillance tech in the US border and the West Bank. The Motorola Solutions also contracts with groups with IDF, with the Israeli Transportation Services, and is generally used at all sorts of checkpoints and borders between Gaza and Israel and between Israel and the West Bank, and of course within illegal settlements within the West Bank. Motorola Solutions is also a company that's supported by the University of Michigan Endowment for a $110 million investment into its quote-unquote strategic partner, Silver Lake Management. Okay, so I talk about this partially because these connections are numerous. The University of Michigan endowment is, and many endowments of this size are invested in all sorts of horrific harms. The University of Michigan endowment is also invested in tobacco companies, despite the University of Michigan having committed to divesting from tobacco over 20 years ago. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's also invested in sectors like Israeli spyware, weapon suppliers, and so on. But the reason I talk about Atenti and Motorola is, of course, these connections are so numerous and can become so complex, it often feels like we're just going insane, because of the complexity. Yet at the same time, they're useful for us because they also lend us clarity in articulating our political vision. Companies like Atenti and Motorola show us that our struggle to end the ways our universities fund horrific violence in Gaza requires us also to contend with the ways our university jails and oppresses students at home. The same enemies may operate in both places through similar mechanisms of funding, enacting one system of oppression. That's not to say somehow that winning on one cause wins them all, of course, but these are intertwined in such a way that we cannot, for example, be abolitionists without recognizing the violence of Israeli apartheid, and vice versa. Our struggle requires us to unite many different fronts to liberate our university as part of the struggle for a free Palestine. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us, we're here to change one thing, which is everything. Now I'll pass the mic to Taran, who will talk to us about pursuing these kinds of connections at Yale University.
Great, thanks so much, Nathan. Should I take over the screen share, or do you want to do the slides?
Yeah, I can just do the slides. So.
Oh, awesome, fantastic. So hi everyone, I'm Taran. I am a grad student at Yale University and a member of the Endowment Justice Collective. We've been doing work on, this group has been doing work on endowment research for a very long time at a university that really has been the spearhead of the entire financialization of higher education. As Dennis mentioned, David Swenson kind of pioneered this endowment model at Yale, and it kind of exploded from there. One of the leading hedge funds that have engineered this model, Farallon Capital, led by Tom Steyer, who ran for president in 2020, if anyone remembers, self-funded his campaign with billions, largely made from seed funding from Yale that he got largely because he was an alumni of the university. And so we've been trying to investigate and pick apart the endowment's connections here at Yale to occupation, genocide, and war in a context that is far more opaque and far more secured than places like Michigan public universities where this information is publicly available. So I'll go over kind of how we build a narrative for divestment from weapons manufacturers here at Yale, while also demanding democratization of the university's corporate board of trustees, and also demanding reinvestment into a local community, New Haven, that's been robbed thin by Yale of land, wealth, and power. You can do the next slide. Thank you. So hopefully this flowchart kind of summarizes all of the things we've talked about so far when it comes to the different investments you can make in a quick way. Whereas there are two primary things: direct investments, where University Investments Office, say the Yale Investments Office in New Haven, decides they're going to buy up stocks, or they're going to buy up ETFs, or make direct investments in bonds from the university's office itself. They'll go and hand over that money themselves. The other way that's become this alternative way of investing is essentially asking somebody else to do that work for you, asking Tom Steyer and Farallon Capital to take over hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars now to go then use their high frequency algorithms for trading and all their complicated systems, all their overpaid analysts to figure out how to maximize profit for Yale without Yale ever really knowing or really caring what they're investing in. Of course, at the end of the day, Yale actually does know this stuff and they can get the information easily, but it's another screen that lets them pretend that they don't know what's going on. And in practice, Yale administrators have negotiated, during negotiations this spring with the encampment organizers, they offered two meetings with trustees. And then when the organizers said meetings would only be useful if we could have some information about the investments that are currently maintained by the university beforehand, so these discussions can be like substantive and meaningful, the university refused, ended negotiations, and made mass arrests. This is like information they really do not want us to know in any sort of capacity. And when public records laws and open meetings laws don't compel them to do so, they're going to guard it with their lives. We've even been told, and you've likely been told at your universities, that the university signs NDAs that with partners that make it impossible to disclose like who their partners are. Largely, they'll claim one thing is either these NDAs serve the partners, protect the partners, or they protect the competitive advantage of the university because they're investing in very secretive special partners that are leading the industry or something. This, of course, is all nonsense because one, they could have not signed those agreements in the first place, and public schools like Michigan disclose their investment funds perfectly well, and they're doing more than all right when it comes to investment returns. In practice, they hide all this information not for their partners' sakes or for financial reasons, but because they don't want to be accountable to the people and to the public. Sadly for them, they are compelled by the federal government to disclose information annually or quarterly, as Derek mentioned, and these filings have helped us at Yale and hopefully can help you at private universities around the country piece together what's happening under the hood. And so if you go to the next slide, Nathan, I'm going to go through kind of the data sources that kind of pick apart these two paths and then show them in practice at Yale and how we've been able to pick apart the endowment with the information that we have publicly available here. So the first thing are the SC13Fs that Derek mentioned, as well as the FOIA request if you're at a public university to figure out what are the direct investments the university holds in equities, stocks, and other derivatives like it. It's harder to find information on bonds, for example, treasury bonds or foreign bonds, or like the Israeli shekel currency forwards, which is a thing I never heard of before, that Michigan holds through these mechanisms, but we can at least get some purchase on what are the equities and stocks they're holding, which is kind of a common way to invest, and certainly the traditional way. On the next slide, we can also track the indirect investments or the use of investment partners by capturing these two different arrows, right? On the left side is this question of who does the university partner with, entrust with their billions of dollars. Former 90s, like Derek mentioned, and a database that I'll reference in a minute, maintained by the SEC, make it possible to match who are these different limited partnerships that are showing up in a 990, and then match them to the exact firms that run them. I'll show in a second, they often will name these anonymously intentionally to obscure who exactly runs the different investment funds. Now, on the right side, once we know the partners that our universities are partnering with, 13Fs for that investment firm. So for example, if you go to Edgar, the SEC website that Derek mentioned earlier, and type in Fairlawn Capital Management, you can see the hundreds and hundreds of stocks that Fairlawn Capital currently invests in. Hedge funds will often have hundreds of these because that's their primary way of investing. But also PitchBook, which is a resource I'll explain in a second, that's likely available through your library, stores information on how different firms and funds invest their dollars in private capital, in private companies, and startups, and venture capital, and more. So the stuff that's not super legible to the SEC is collected by these folks in other database for our use. And news articles and websites can also kind of give you some information, as I'll show in a second in an example at Yale. Nathan? Thanks. So to kind of demystify all these forms and database we've talked about, hopefully this can kind of give one really quick screenshot or a snapshot of what's happening in these different data sources. So we talked about 13F from the SEC shows what institutional and asset managers hold directly in equity holdings. So these are stocks, normal corporate stocks in the stock market. This only applies to institutional managers that invest more than $100 million a year. So Yale, Harvard, these really big universities will often do that. Smaller universities, for example, Southern Connecticut State University, which is also in New Haven, doesn't file one of these because they just give all of their money to one wealth manager that does all the work for them. They don't do any direct investing at all. So if you don't see it from your university, that might be why. There are also possibly other reasons these forms don't show up for you, and those are things the network is trying to piece together. So if that's true for you, we'd like to honestly talk to you and figure out why are universities able to dodge these disclosure requirements in some cases and not in others. Another version is the Form 990 that Derek also mentioned, filed to the IRS, available at ProPublica, that documents all the investment vehicles and funds that universities are investing in. This, again, doesn't always document, it can be hit or miss, as Derek mentioned. It doesn't document every single fund sometimes, and it can be kind of unclear which ones are still active, but more or less this can be a really useful tool in our research. And PitchBook, like I said, is a data set or a service that should hopefully be available from your library for free. Business schools use this pretty often. Yes, I can slow down. Sorry, try to make sure I don't keep people over time, but I talk quickly too. But PitchBook is a useful resource that allows us to track exactly like the deals, the commitments, and the investments that different funds and firms make, all compiled by a bunch of folks kind of tracking every single news article, filing they can find before the government into one accessible data set for us. Yeah, thanks. So if we look at 13F for Yale, which is a $40 billion endowment, we might ask, like, okay, what stocks are they investing in? Their 13F only shows $39 million in investments, which is less than 1.1% of the entire endowment. So this thing, the 13F screenshot on the right shows us they have some investments in biotech stocks, Coinbase, a Bitcoin stock, and then 2 ETFs that, for what it's worth, are linked to numerous major weapons manufacturers that arm Israel. Thinking of like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, the Adani Group. But building a narrative for a campaign around these alone is hard and often subject to critique. People might say it's not that much. I mean, again, this is 0.1%, less than of the entire endowment. And we have questions of like, can they really do anything about this? So these missing billions, I mean, I think these ETFs kind of describe the way that these weapons manufacturers are so common in the financial sector and in the different assets that they produce. So these missing billions likely involve investments in the array of companies that are in these ETFs, and also the much wider world of startups and private equity that aren't going to be publicly traded, that Nathan just mentioned, for example, the University of Michigan, that go beyond the standard set of arms dealers and help fuel the narrative for divestment more clearly and spell it out. So if we go over to the Form 990 using ProPublica, as Derek mentioned, we can pull up Yale's filing, and Nathan, I'll just like page through the next two slides. We can pull up just like a lot of information about Yale's investments. Actually, I can go back one. Sorry, I forgot what order they were. We get a lot of information about Yale's investments, Yale's general financial stature and its investment income, the sort of like revenue and expenses it has every single year. It's a lot of information that kind of documents just how massive and massively wealthy Yale is, governed by several representatives of finance capital and its board of trustees, and not a single person from the surrounding community, from its employees, or from its students. So as Dennis referenced, these endowments are way more than just like a contingency fund. They function to hoard billions of dollars of wealth for institutional expansion. And in New Haven particularly, Yale has hoarded this wealth to expand the university at the expense of our community. Yale has made over 60% of the land in our city exempt from taxation, including, by the way, the headquarters of its private police force, which works to push working class New Haveners away from the boundaries of our campus. And it makes these billions and billions of dollars a year through investment income and other things, while refusing to fork over the few $100 million it owes the city in taxes, millions that would fund housing, education, and resources for the community we all reside in. So Yale will often spin all its information in something positive. It'll talk about philanthropy and donations, scholarships for people in the community. But these filings really put just like in context how egregious wealth hoarding fundamentally is. It's billions and billions of dollars in endowment, 40 billion, that it holds and doesn't do anything with, but to fund the university's own operations for a small percentage of, and otherwise just sort of maintain wealth in a city that has deprived so much of. And for our campaign, this is sort of contextualize a lot of the work that we talk about investment from fossil fuels, from weapons, from anything else that's exploitive and extractive. It's actually part of like the broader nature of Yale to be a bad neighbor to the world and a bad neighbor to New Haven. So we pull up Schedule R of this 990 to get into the shell company, the investment funds and shell companies that Derek mentioned earlier. We can get we got a list of 155, I believe, in the latest filing, different investment funds that Yale currently hold investments in. And these are sort of like named in ways that are kind of anonymous, some of them more clear. So for example, number 4, Farallon Capital Institutional Partners 2 is just Farallon Capital Management, one of the pioneers of this entire investment strategy that Dennis mentioned earlier. But there are also some others too that I have no idea what they are, just looking at the name. So Wingspan LP is the third biggest partner for Yale, and it's totally unclear what that could be, right? There's no investment partner just named Wingspan. Same thing with Foxway. But these are clearly firms that hold a lot of money, and we want to figure out what they are so we can trace the investments they're making. Likely hundreds and hundreds of deals and investments in private equity and venture capital we want to unpack. And it's also worth noting some of these are invested some of these funds are based in places like the Cayman Islands, CJ for Wingspan LP, which is sort of a signal immediately that's a tax haven. Others are Delaware and Nevada. That should kind of make alarm bells ring as like, what on earth are these investments for, and why are they based in places that are not in any way Connecticut or a normal state, not New York, but rather places used primarily to dodge taxes. And among these are other firms like Sale NH, or funds like Sale NH, which is totally unclear like what that could possibly be. Perhaps Yale's invested in boats. Wingspan, Foxway, and all these others are totally obscure to us. And that's intentional, right? To hide like which partners your university entrusts with the endowment. So one benefit of this research network is that we've been able to scrape the entirety of an SEC database called the IAPD, or Investor Advisor Public Disclosure Database, to make identification in some cases possible, taking these names of funds and then finding out which firms disclose that they actually run those funds, even though, so they can't really get away with this anonymity all the time. This large database is available as a spreadsheet on my GitHub personal account. So you can like download it at this link, and like if you were doing 990 research, just search manually for the names that show up in the Schedule R of your university's 990. We're working on making this accessible for everybody. So if you've got like technical chops or interested in making a website or something like that, it's another reason to join the network, because you'll have to have your skills and trying to make this like a useful tool for organizers, and more than just like a single spreadsheet that's kind of big and hard to figure out what's going on. But from this alone, we see that Sale NH is run by Insight Venture Partners, a large venture capital firm that turns out is implicated in multiple defense corporations and in Israeli industries. So now that we know a couple of these managers, right, like Farallon Capital was, just by the name we know, Farallon Capital Institutional Partners 2 is in fact Farallon Capital Management, and some others that were referenced there. Wingspan is actually managed by Bracebridge Capital, a firm that once helped Yale profit off of Argentina's financial crisis, and a bunch of other firms that have been involved in pretty devastating things: payday lenders, student loan lenders, and more. We can start to like look at these different partners and figure out like what are they investing in. So Farallon Capital, a hedge fund, discloses on its SEC 13F millions and millions of dollars invested in Howmet Aerospace, a key supplier for Israel's F-35s. So that's one pretty direct tie to the genocide in Palestine and Israeli weapons. Insight Venture Partners is another firm that we just were able to kind of trace back who actually is running Sale NHLP. It turns out they brag about like their startups, which claim they like maximize lethality, and they have a really strong regional focus on Israeli companies. They're very proud, for example, of investing in firms led by former IDF soldiers, especially in the cybersecurity sector in Israel. Nathan. Thanks. So that's a really quick survey of all of these things that are going on at Yale. And in fact, there are like billions and billions of dollars left that I didn't get to unpack here that show ties between Yale and the weapons industry through these different investment partners. And there are still billions and billions more unknown, likely in real estate, bonds, currencies, and other assets that we actually can't yet trace through these different measures. Yale, for example, owns a country club I believe in Maryland, and like was one of the largest landowners in Maine for several years, as it owned land for timber. So Yale is all over the world, and we want to unpack all these things. We can only get a purchase on a few of these different ties and connections right now. But nonetheless, with this from Insight Partners, Farallon Capital, JLL Partners, which is another firm that Yale invests with, which is actively invested in Jonathan Engineered Solutions, a key supplier for several arms manufacturers, we kind of like get a clear narrative of what's going on. Yale, a university with a history of abusing New Haven and extracting value from destructive investments around the world, entrusts its billions to investment partners that see weapons manufacturers as critical to their investment strategy, and specifically manufacturers that are arming Israel in the Palestinian genocide today. So we're calling for redress on all of these counts, right? Disclosure of the full extent of weapons investments beyond that which we can trace through these like few piecemeal mechanisms. So we can see disclosure on the scale of the University of Michigan or Washington and other places. Divestment from those current holdings and a clear refusal to make any further ones in weapons manufacturers, and reinvestment into the city of New Haven that Yale continually denies critical funds for public services and for human life. So Yale helped spearhead the neoliberalization and financialization of higher education, as Dennis mentioned earlier. But I think the student movement here and around the world are working actively, and I hope will be victorious in returning universities to the people, their communities and neighbors, and a true justice liberation in Palestine and their communities and around the world. sorry that was so fast, but hopefully we didn't hold people over too long. And I think I'll pass it over to Kian to open up for Q&A.
Yeah, just want to direct you all again to this QR code. Feel free to scan it or click the link in the chat. If someone could send it out again, that would be great. Or contact any of us personally to get involved with the Endowment Justice Research Network. We would love to share more slowly and interpersonally our work with you. And I want to pick out a couple of questions from the Q&A, and anyone can pick them up. First of all, I wanted to shout this question from Kamala Russell. What is the difference between the investments listed on regular SEC filings and the limited partnerships listed on a 990? The former are direct stock or index fund investments short-term, and the latter are private equity partnerships long-term. Does anyone want to clarify?
I can take a quick stab, and if anybody else has like insight into this too. I mean, I'm still sort of making sense out of all this stuff. It's so convoluted, but like, I think that the SEC filings have involves like direct holdings, and that the what's disclosed in the 990s and the different types of 990s has to do with partnerships. So like, for example, it might not be University of Chicago, like direct stock investments in ExxonMobil, right? But ExxonMobil and University of Chicago like form a partnership, and it's called like whatever, ExxonMobil LP or whatever, or something like that, right? And that might be invested in something, right? And then also like on this question about like the regular 990s versus 990Ts, again, I'm not like entirely sure. But what I think that it has to do with is like there's different forms of these are tax filings, right? And these are nonprofit institutions that are reporting these tax filings. And so it has to do, so I think it has to do like whether the income is, if it's sort of related to something more directly related to like the nonprofit and its purpose. I think that goes in like a 990R versus like a 990T is unrelated. So that just might be like a partnership that a university might be invested in that's like unrelated to the institution's activities, but I'm not totally sure. So yeah, I mean, if anybody else has like knows what that stuff's about too, feel free to chime in.
And if not, we can move to another question. I was going to say, I wanted to take this question. Does a university have any accountability to donors with regard to the endowment? Yeah.
So I can answer this kind of quickly based on some experience I had with fossil fuel divestment at my undergrad, Penn State. So it turns out there's an entire like set of laws behind like how nonprofits, specifically universities and similar institutions, invest their money. And part of this is like seeking profit, making sure they like consider the institution's mission, but not too much, et cetera. I think it's a whole world that like we haven't unpacked as a research group yet, but I think is actually something that's like fruitful and possibly a source of leverage for the divestment movement. If you look at the Climate Defense Project, which is work to basically file legal complaints in numerous states against universities that invest their endowments in fossil fuels, you can see text that especially that focuses on the fact that these investments in fossil fuels are bad investments, they're bad bets. And they argue that those investments, essentially by pursuing those investments, these universities are violating the law that requires them to seek sort of like profit-making things and also be accountable to the university's fundamental mission, which is incongruent with like investing in things that destroy the earth and their communities. Thank you, Nate. Oh, sorry, I thought someone else said something. I think somebody who's watching this was an intern at CDP, but it's a very, yes, thank you. But anyways, to say that like, there's like a whole other route of possible work under this argument of like, these are bad investments in weapons in Israeli corporations and such, that might be a fruitful path for the divestment movement. And I think like CDP and the work that these schools have done is a useful example.
Yeah, Dennis, go ahead.
So I just wanted to chime in and also add that, in terms of accountability to donors, it's not as though, if I say made a gift to the endowment 20 or 30 years ago, I can now say, hey, it turns out that you all have used that in ways that I no longer agree with, and so give me my money back. Obviously, the greatest leverage that donors have is threats of withholding future donations. That said, there is such a thing as like restricted versus unrestricted endowment gifts, which is something that university finance offices will also often bring up to activists who are asking about divestment. Or usually actually when people are asking for investment, like, hey, can you fund X, Y, or Z thing that we think is good, whether it's reparations or community benefit programs. And they'll say, well, we can't really do that because so much of our endowment is restricted. So the big difference is, people can make gifts that then have to be used for certain things. You could, I guess, put a condition on a gift that it not be invested in, say, weapons manufacturers or climate change causing, fossil fuel extraction or whatever. And then unrestricted gifts can be used to fund anything. The last thing I'll say about that is that none of that applies to reinvested profits. And so that's a really important way that colleges and universities both get money to fund stuff that like nobody would give money to fund, as well as like create new investment opportunities. So like once you reinvest, like if you take money that you realize profits on, you don't spend it on operations and you put it back into the endowment, there's obviously no restrictions on that. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, Nathan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I guess just adding to a lot of the same what Dennis has said. I remember when I was an undergrad, actually, at Yale, so a lot of the same divestment demands for that at that time around climate, they were simply met with, oh, we can't do anything about like how the endowment is used. So like we can't, for example, like give more money back to New Haven and actually spend the endowments to use the endowments to expand quote unquote voluntary contribution that Yale was making at the time and so on. So this narrative of restricted funds essentially can be very useful to the university to escape the criticism that activism tries to bring. And then the other thing is that I think in general, we found that the endowment is beholden to donors, but in ways that have been disadvantageous for us. Basically, they have not been helpful for us because these donors, of course, they're the ones with like millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, of course, and they can use the endowment in ways that benefit them. So, for example, Stephen Ross, who's a New York real estate guy, he's a billionaire, a pretty evil guy. He was like found guilty of like tax fraud and all that. He donated $100 million into the endowment, specifically to fund a specific project, which is a center for innovation that the University of Michigan is building in Detroit. And guess who's building the Center for Innovation? None other than Stephen Ross's own company, which is the related companies. So these relationships that the donors share with the endowments, there might be potential to leverage there, but in reality, what we've found is that the class aspirations from these donors are often the same, the kind of allegiances that the endowment holds as a whole, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah. I think that do we want to take one more question or do we feel like we're a little over? Anyone have a sense? I think let's take one more. I was wanting just to poke when are 990s usually published? I guess I'm assuming this means like on a yearly basis.
Yeah, so you have to file them annually, and then it usually it takes like a little while for them to get online. So for example, the ones that were filed for 2023 just pretty recently um, are searchable on ProPublica. It's possible you might be able to get them earlier, like if you went to the IRS or something. I'm not sure, but um, uh, uh, yeah, they're published annually, and you can usually get a hold of them I don't know, maybe a year after.
Sweet, yeah. Thanks, Derek. And with that, thank you all for attending our webinar tonight. As Nathan just posted, all of our contact information is in the chat. If anyone wants to reach out, feel free to copy it down somewhere. And do we want to just put this QR code back on the screen one more time for just a second? I'll see if I can share.
Yeah,
Oh, do you have it?
yeah, here we go.
Sweet. Yeah, if anyone didn't get a chance to scan this, feel free to do it now. And we hope to see you guys at anything else we do in the future. We're really grateful to have so many people here for our first public facing event. Yeah, good night.
Thanks all for coming.
Bye.